Before 1959, American companies shipped hundreds of locomotives to Cuba, from Baldwin and Alco to General Electric. These engines were built to power the world's sugar capital. Then, the revolution hit. The embargo sealed the island, and every one of those machines was stranded. No parts, no support, no way home. That was over 60 years ago. Yet hidden across remote sugar mills and overgrown rail yards, hundreds remain. Some the last surviving examples of designs scrapped everywhere else on Earth. The question is not how they got there. It is why no one came back for them, and whether anyone will before they vanish for good. Across Cuba, the remains of American-built locomotives linger in silence. They sit in tangled cane fields tucked behind crumbling mill walls or abandoned on sidings where the rails have vanished beneath weeds. There is no official map, no published inventory, just a scattered fleet, numbering in the hundreds, each one a relic of a vanished era. Some are rusted hulks, stripped for parts and forgotten. Others, though battered, still hold their builder plates. Baldwin, Alco, General Electric. The true count is elusive, but field surveys and enthusiast logs suggest at least 600 American engines survived into the 21st century, with dozens more hidden out of sight. For every locomotive documented by visiting rail historians, many more remain unlisted, their serial numbers fading in the tropical sun. In some provinces, entire yards exist where only the local mechanics know which engines are still standing. These machines are not museum pieces, they are survivors, left behind by history, scattered from Pinar del Rio to Santiago, forming a hidden network that few outside Cuba have ever seen. Their presence raises a question that has never been fully answered. Why, after all these years, do so many American locomotives remain stranded here, invisible to the world and untouched by time? The scale of this hidden fleet is not just a curiosity, it is a puzzle that demands a closer look at the forces that left them marooned, and at the stories waiting in the shadows of Cuba's lost railways. In 1837, a train rolled out of Havana toward Bejucal, making Cuba the first place in Latin America, and even ahead of Spain itself, to run a public railway. This 17-mile stretch was more than a technical feat. It was a signal of what would follow. Sugar profits fueled the project. But so did the ambitions of Cuban landowners and foreign investors eager to connect cane fields to the port. Within a few decades, the island's rail network outpaced Spain's, growing to 1,200 kilometers by 1865. The real acceleration came with American capital. In 1903, a new reciprocity treaty slashed tariffs on Cuban sugar entering the United States. That single policy unleashed a wave of United States investment. Banks like National City Bank opened credit lines, and American sugar companies poured millions into new mills and the rails to serve them. By 1907, the Cuba Company, backed by $68 million in United States funds, controlled half the island's railway lines. Contracts for locomotives and rolling stock flowed from American manufacturers, Baldwin, Alco, and later General Electric, straight to Cuban ports. For the next 50 years, this pipeline of American money and machinery shaped the island's railways. Locomotive orders were paid for with sugar futures and bank loans underwritten in New York. Each new line or mill expansion meant another shipment of American-built engines. By the eve of the revolution, Cuba's rail density led the world, with most of its rolling stock bearing American builders' plates and financed through American banks. This deep dependency explains why so many United States locomotives ended up marooned in Cuba. Once the political tides turned, there was no easy way to replace or repatriate them. At the heart of Cuba's sugar industry, railways were more than a link to market. They were the backbone of every harvest. Each sugar mill operated as a small city, surrounded by sprawling cane fields that stretched for miles in every direction. To move thousands of tons of cane from field to factory before it spoiled Mills built their own rail networks, private spurs that snaked deep into the countryside. By the 1950s, these plantation lines totaled around 1,500 kilometers, a hidden web of narrow-gauge track running parallel to the public railways. During harvest season, known as the Zafra, the logistics became a race against time. Cane had to be cut, loaded, and delivered to the mill within hours, or its sugar content would drop. That meant dozens of trains running day and night, each one hauling loaded wagons from remote fields to the mill, then returning empty for another round. A single large mill could need 20 or more locomotives just to keep up with the pace. Multiply that by the hundreds of active mills, and the demand for motive power soared. These private fleets weren't a luxury. They were a necessity. The main lines couldn't handle the constant flow, and trucks were no match for the rough terrain or the sheer volume involved. Mills ordered locomotives in bulk, sometimes financing entire shipments on the promise of next year's crop. By the eve of the revolution, the island's sugar sector ran one of the densest private rail networks anywhere in the world. This logistical arms race explains why so many engines ended up marooned in Cuba, and why decades later so many still linger out of sight, hidden where the cane once grew thick. In 1959, the Cuban Revolution swept through the island's cane fields and mill towns, toppling the Batista regime and upending the old order. Within months, the new government issued sweeping decrees, and all foreign-owned sugar mills, rail lines, and their rolling stock were seized and placed under state control. American companies lost their assets overnight, from Havana's grand terminals to the most remote plantation tracks. For decades, these networks had relied on a steady flow of parts and technical support from the United States. That supply chain snapped in 1960 when the United States imposed a full trade embargo. Shipments of spare parts, technical manuals, and even correspondence were halted by law. Locomotives that once ran on predictable schedules now faced a sudden shortage of bearings, pistons, and electrical components. Workshop foremen scoured the yards for anything salvageable, cannibalizing sidelined engines to keep others running. The embargo didn't just freeze trade, it stranded an entire fleet of American-built locomotives in Cuba, cutting them off from the lifeline they depended on. As the embargo tightened, the practical reality set in. The machines that powered the island's sugar harvests would have to survive without outside help. The challenge shifted from policy to the workshop floor, where mechanics faced a daily battle to keep the old engines moving, using whatever tools and materials they could find. Workshop doors slammed shut on the outside world in 1960. The embargo didn't just block new engines, it cut off the lifeblood of maintenance. Bearings, once ordered by part number from Pennsylvania, vanished from the supply chain overnight. Pistons wore thin and cracked, with no replacements arriving by ship or plane. Electrical systems, already temperamental in Cuba's humidity, began to fail for want of a single relay or coil. Mechanics opened crates from the last American shipments and found them nearly empty. Everything from traction motor brushes to oil seals became scarce. Even the most basic fittings, bolts, gaskets, and lubricants were soon impossible to find. The result was a daily scramble. Foremen scoured deadlines for anything salvageable. One engine's broken axle meant another might run for a week. Cannibalization became routine, with entire locomotives stripped to keep a handful moving. Workshop logs from the early 1960s record engines sidelined for want of a $5 bearing or a piston ring that could no longer be machined from scrap. These shortages weren't abstract. They made the embargo painfully real, forcing every repair into an act of improvisation. The fleet's survival now depended on ingenuity, not access to the parts catalog. What once was routine maintenance became a test of endurance, and every missing component pushed these American machines closer to the shadows. One engine stands out among the shadows. Baldwin 040 Fireless, number 1239, built in 1921, still sits in the overgrown yard of the former Marta Abreu mill. Its builder's plate remains bolted to the frame, a silent witness to a vanished era. This locomotive is not just rare, it is the last of its kind anywhere in the world. Field photographs from 2003, cross-referenced with Baldwin's own construction books, confirm its identity and survival. Yet for every engine like number 1239 that can be traced, there are dozens more whose existence depends on rumor and the memories of local mechanics. Surveys suggest that about 30% of these American survivors are in C-grade condition, structurally sound, but missing key components. Half have fallen to D-grade, little more than hollow shells rusting in the tropical heat, stripped for parts, or buried under cane. Without a formal registry, the true count is always in doubt. Knowledge of their whereabouts is passed by word of mouth, guarded by workshop foremen and old hands who know which locked shed or remote siding still holds a forgotten engine. These hidden yards, scattered from Villa Clara to Camagüey, form a secret network, one that outsiders rarely glimpse. The lack of official records means that even the most determined historian must rely on visual proof and the testimony of those who work in the shadows, keeping the story of Cuba's lost locomotives alive through secrecy as much as survival. Luis Garcia arrives at the Villa Clara workshop before sunrise, the same way he has for 40 years. His hands, shaped by decades of repair, move across the battered frame of a GE switcher as if reading a familiar story. When a traction motor bearing fails, there is no hope of ordering a replacement. Luis heats scrap steel, machines it on a lathe rebuilt from Soviet parts, and measures every cut by eye. He winds copper coils by hand, stripping wire from decommissioned transformers, counting each turn to match the original American specs. When a cracked frame threatens to sideline an engine, he welds it with homemade electrodes, working by the glow of a single bulb. Each repair is an act of invention. Nothing comes from a catalog, and every fix must outlast the last. Luis keeps a notebook filled with sketches and measurements, a personal archive of solutions that exist nowhere else. For him, these locomotives are more than machines, they are companions, survivors of embargo and neglect, kept alive by the stubborn pride of a mechanic who refuses to let them go quietly. When the last American spare parts ran out, Cuba looked east for relief. Soviet rail aid began arriving in the 1960s, bringing new classes of locomotives that towered over their American predecessors. The TEM-2, a 2,800 horsepower diesel-electric, became a workhorse in sugar country. CHME-3 switchers and M62 mainline diesels joined the fleet, their boxy profiles and Cyrillic plates a visible sign of Cuba's changing alliances. Soviet engines came with barter agreements, oil for sugar, and for a time, a steady supply of parts. Workshops learned to service these machines alongside the battered Baldwins and Alcos, sometimes swapping components between them. But the system was always fragile. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Overnight, the flow of parts and technical support vanished. Cuban mechanics faced a new scarcity, this time with no superpower to fill the gap. Engines that had run for decades were sidelined for want of a single relay or fuel pump. The old American locomotives, already patched and weary, were pressed back into service wherever possible. No amount of ingenuity could offset the loss of an entire industrial supply chain. The hidden fleet slipped further into neglect, and the risk of permanent loss grew, making the question of preservation more urgent than ever. Cuban Ministry of Transportation budgets from 2018 to 2020 show a glaring omission. Not a single peso was set aside for cataloging or preserving historic locomotives. Official budget documents list spending on track upgrades, new rolling stock, and signaling systems, but heritage preservation never appears as a line item. The sum allocated to research and documentation, barely a fraction of a percent, covers only freight studies, not inventory or restoration of the aging American fleet. Without a dedicated fund, no national survey has ever been attempted. The fate of each locomotive depends on the memory of a few senior mechanics, not on any formal registry. Workshop managers confirm that requests for basic conservation materials go unanswered, leaving rust and theft unchecked. International rail preservation groups have offered technical help, but their proposals stall without matching funds from the Cuban side. As a result, the country's rarest engines remain invisible to donors and at risk of vanishing altogether. The absence of institutional support has left Cuba's hidden fleet exposed to time and the elements, with no official plan to save what's left. Dr. Peter Klein, a railroad historian from Stuttgart, arrived in Cuba in the late 1990s with a mission to match the battered locomotives scattered across the island to the original builder records in the United States. Armed with a battered notebook and decades of research, he began collecting photographic evidence, close-ups of builders' plates, faded serial numbers, and hand-scratched works numbers still clinging to rusted frames. Klein cross-referenced these photos with Baldwin's construction ledgers and Alco's order books, tracing each number back to its original build date and purchaser. In one case, he confirmed that the Baldwin 040 fireless number 1239 at Marta Abreu was not just rare, it was the last of its kind anywhere. His findings, backed by photographic logs and manufacturer archives, established that many of Cuba's surviving locomotives are globally unique. This hard evidence would later prove essential in arguing for their preservation, giving the hidden fleet a documented claim to world railway heritage. Legal protection for Cuba's locomotives begins with Law 63, passed in 1995. This statute defines historic railway equipment as national patrimony, making it illegal to export, scrap, or alter these engines without state approval. Maria Ramos, director of the Instituto Nacional de Patrimonio Cultural, points to the law as the backbone of Cuba's preservation effort. Under its terms, even a rusted Baldwin or Alco hidden in a cane field is considered a protected artifact. Museum curators and heritage experts confirm that Law 63 covers every locomotive built before 1960, regardless of its condition or location. The law's reach is broad. Many engines remain exposed to theft or decay, but on paper, each one is part of the nation's cultural legacy. This legal shield explains why so many rare American locomotives, even in derelict states, have not been lost to foreign collectors or the scrapyard. As American railroads sent more than 25,000 Baldwins and Alcos to the torch in the mid-20th century, Cuba's embargoed fleet slipped into an accidental time capsule. The irony is hard to ignore. What vanished from U.S. rails survives, battered but real, behind locked gates and rusted fences. Yet survival by isolation is not a preservation plan. Without action, these last examples will vanish one by one. A practical path exists: a full photographic and GPS inventory, open access records, and partnerships with international heritage groups. Funding proposals call for $2 million for restoration, enough to document and stabilize the most threatened engines. For mechanics like Luis Garcia, who have kept these machines alive through willpower and scrap metal, the question is urgent. Will the world step in before the last survivor is lost to the weeds? Today, some of the world's rarest American locomotives sit quietly in Cuban fields, vanishing with each passing season. As global preservation efforts race against rust and neglect, the fate of this hidden fleet hangs in the balance. Their survival now depends on recognition, not just nostalgia. What we fail to protect today, history will erase tomorrow. Share your thoughts below. Should these relics be saved or left to time?